Καλησπέρα και καλώς ήρθατε σε άλλη μια λέξη εκφραστικής ανάγνωσης εν μέσω κορονοϊού 2020. Laurence Sterne, The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman. Τα ράση τους ανθρώπους ու τα πράγματα, αλλά τα περί των πραγμάτων δόγματα. Volume 2, 1760. Chapter 1. I have begun a new book on purpose that I might have room enough to explain the nature of the perplexities in which my Uncle Toby was involved, from the many discourses and interrogations about the siege of Namur, where he received his wound. I must remind the reader, in case he has read the history of King William's wars, but if he has not, I then inform him that one of the most memorable attacks in that siege was that which was made by the English and Dutch upon the point of the advanced counterscarp, before the gate of St. Nicholas, which enclosed the great sluice or water-stop, where the English were terribly exposed to the shot of the counter-guard and demi-bastion of St. Roch. The issue of which hot dispute, in 3 words, was this, that the Dutch lodged themselves upon the counter-guard, and that the English made themselves masters of the covered way before St. Nicholas's gate, notwithstanding the gallantry of the French officers who exposed themselves upon the glacis sword in hand. As this was the principal attack of which my Uncle Toby was an eye-witness at Namur, the army of the besiegers being cut off by the confluence of the Maes and the Sambre from seeing much of each other's operations, my Uncle Toby was generally more eloquent and particular in his account of it, and the many perplexities he was in arose out of the almost insurmountable difficulties he found in telling his story intelligibly, and giving such clear ideas of the differences and distinctions between the scarp and counterscarp, the glacis and covered way, the half-moon dravelin, as to make his company fully comprehend where and what he was about. Writers themselves are too apt to confound these terms, so that you will the less wonder if, in his endeavours to explain them, and in opposition to many misconceptions, that my Uncle Toby did oft times puzzle his visitors, and sometimes himself too. To speak the truth, unless the company my father led upstairs were tolerably clear-headed, or my Uncle Toby was in one of his best explanatory moods, it was a difficult thing, do what he could to keep the discourse free from obscurity. What rendered the account of this affair the more intricate to my Uncle Toby was this, that in the attack of the counterscarp before the gate of St. Nicholas, extending itself from the bank of the Maes quite up to the great water-stop, the ground was cut and cross-cut with such a multitude of dykes, drains, rivulets, and sluices on all sides, and he would get so sadly bewildered and set fast amongst them, that frequently he could neither get backwards or forwards to save his life, and was oft times obliged to give up the attack upon that very account only. These perplexing rebuffs gave my Uncle Toby Shandy more perturbations than you would imagine, and as my father's kindness to him was continually dragging up fresh friends and fresh inquirers, he had but a very uneasy task of it. No doubt my Uncle Toby had great command of himself, and could guard appearances, I believe, as well as most men. Yet any one may imagine that when he could not retreat out of the ravelin without getting into the half-moon, or get out of the covered way without falling down the counterscarp, nor cross the dyke without danger of slipping into the ditch, but that he must have fretted and fumed inwardly, he did so. And these little and hourly vexations, which may seem trifling and of no account to the man who has not read Hippocrates, yet whoever has read Hippocrates or Dr. James Mackenzie, and has considered well the effects which the passions and affections of the mind have upon the digestion, why not of a wound as well as of a dinner, may easily conceive what sharper paroxysms and exacerbations of his wound my Uncle Toby must have undergone upon that score only. My Uncle Toby could not philosophize upon it. It was enough he felt it was so, and having sustained the pain and sorrows of it for 3 months together, he was resolved some way or other to extricate himself. He was one morning lying upon his back in his bed, the anguish and nature of the wound upon his groin suffering him to lie in no other position, when a thought came into his head that if he could purchase such a thing and have it pasted down upon a board, as a large map of the fortifications of the town and citadel of Namur, with its environs, it might be a means of giving him ease. I take notice of his desire to have the environs along with the town and citadel for this reason, because my Uncle Toby's wound was got in one of the traverses about 30 toises from the returning angle of the trench, opposite to the salient angle of the demi-bastion of St. Roch, so that he was pretty confident he could stick a pin upon the identical spot of ground where he was standing in when the stone struck him. All this succeeded to his wishes, and not only freed him from a world of sad explanations, but in the end it proved the happy means, as you will read, of procuring my Uncle Toby his hobby horse. Chapter 2. There is nothing so foolish, when you are at the expense of making an entertainment of this kind, as to order things so badly as to let your critics and gentry of refined taste run it down. Nor is there anything so likely to make them do it as that of leaving them out of the party, or, what is full as offensive, of bestowing your attention upon the rest of your guests in so particular a way as if there was no such thing as a critic by occupation at table. I guard against both. For, in the first place, I have left half a dozen places purposely open for them, and in the next place I pay them all court. Gentlemen, I kiss your hands. I protest no company could give me half the pleasure. By my soul, I am glad to see you. I beg only you will make no strangers of yourselves, but sit down without any ceremony, and fall on heartily. I said I had left 6 places, and I was upon the point of carrying my complaisance so far as to have left a 7th open for them, and in this very spot I stand on. But being told by a critic, though not by occupation, but by nature, that I had acquitted myself well enough, I shall fill it up directly, hoping, in the meantime, that I shall be able to make a great deal of more room next year. How, in the name of wonder, could your Uncle Toby, who, it seems, was a military man, and whom you have represented as no fool, be at the same time such a confused, pudding-headed, muddle-headed fellow as go look? So, Sir Critic, I could have replied, but I scorn it. 'Tis language unurbane, and only befitting the man who cannot give clear and satisfactory accounts of things, or dive deep enough into the first causes of human ignorance and confusion. It is moreover the reply valiant, and therefore I reject it. For though it might have suited my Uncle Toby's character as a soldier excellently well, and had he not accustomed himself in such attacks to whistle the L.Ă, as he wanted no courage, 'tis the very answer he would have given. Yet it would by no means have done for me. You see as plain as can be that I write as a man of erudition, that even my similes, my allusions, my illustrations, my metaphors are erudite, and that I must sustain my character properly, and contrast it properly too, else what would become of me? Why, sir, I should be undone. At this very moment that I am going to here to fill up one place against a critic, I should have made an opening for a couple. Therefore I answer thus. Pray, sir, in all the reading which you have ever read, did you ever read such a book as Locke's Essay upon the Human Understanding? Don't answer me rashly, because many, I know, quote the book who have not read it, and many have read it who understand it not. If either of these is your case, as I write to instruct, I will tell you in 3 words what the book is. It is a history. A history of who, what, where, when. Don't hurry yourself. It is a history book, sir, which may possibly recommend it to the world, of what passes in a man's own mind. And if you will say so much of the book, and no more, believe me, you will cut no contemptible figure in a metaphysics circle. But this by the way. Now, if you will venture to go along with me and look down into the bottom of this matter, it will be found that the cause of obscurity and confusion in the mind of man is threefold. Dull organs, dear sir, in the first place. Secondly, slight and transient impressions made by objects when the said organs are not dull. And thirdly, a memory like unto a sieve, not able to retain what it has received. Call down Dolly, your chambermaid, and I will give you my cap and bell along with it, if I make not this matter so plain that Dolly herself shall understand it as well as Malbranche. When Dolly has indited her epistle to Robin, and has thrust her arm into the bottom of her pocket hanging by her right side, take that opportunity to recollect that the organs and faculties of perception can, by nothing in this world, be so aptly typified and explained as by that one thing which Dolly's hand is in search of. Your organs are not so dull that I should inform you 'tis an inch, sir, of red seal-wax. When this is melted and dropped upon the letter, if Dolly fumbles too long for her thimble till the wax is over-hardened, it will not receive the mark of her thimble from the usual impulse which was wont to imprint it. Very well. If Dolly's wax, for want of better, is beeswax, or of a temper too soft, though it may receive, it will not hold the impression, how hard soever Dolly thrusts against it. And last of all, supposing the wax good, and eke the thimble, but applied thereto in careless haste, as her mistress rings the bell, in any of these three cases, the print left by the thimble will be as unlike the prototype as a brass jack. Now you must understand that not one of these was the true cause of the confusion in my Uncle Toby's discourse, and it is for that very reason I enlarge upon them so long, after the manner of great physiologists, to show the world what it did not arise from. What it did arise from, I have hinted above, and a fertile source of obscurity it is, and ever will be, and that is the unsteady uses of words which have perplexed the clearest and most exalted understandings. It is 10 to 1 that authors, whether you have ever read the literary histories of past ages, if you have, what terrible battles, yclept logomachies, have they occasioned and perpetuated with so much gall and inkshed, that a good-natured man cannot read the accounts of them without tears in his eyes. Gentle critic, when thou hast weighed all this, and considered within thyself how much of thy own knowledge, discourse, and conversation has been pestered and disordered, at one time or other, by this and this only, what a pudder and racket in councils about ousia and hypostasis, and in the schools of the learned about power and about spirit, about essences and about quintessences, about substances and about space, but confusion in greater theatres from words of little meaning and as indeterminate a sense. When thou considerest this, thou wilt not wonder at my Uncle Toby's perplexities. Thou wilt drop a tear of pity upon his scarp and his counterscarp, his glaces and his covered way, his ravelin and his half-moon. 'Twas not by ideas. By heaven, his life was put in jeopardy by words. Chapter 3. When my Uncle Toby got his map of Namur to his mind, he began immediately to apply himself, and with the utmost diligence, to the study of it, for nothing being of more importance to him than his recovery, and his recovery depending, as you have read, upon the passions and affections of his mind, it behoved him to take the nicest care to make himself so far master of his subject as to be able to talk upon it without emotion. In a fortnight's close and painful application, which, by the by, did my Uncle Toby's wound upon his groin no good, he was enabled, by the help of some marginal documents at the feet of the elephant, together with Gebesius's military architecture and pyrobology, translated from the Flemish, to form his discourse with passable perspicuity. And before he was 2 full months gone, he was right eloquent upon it, and could make not only the attack of the advanced counterscarp with great order, but having by that time gone much deeper into the art than what his first motive made necessary, my Uncle Toby was able to cross the Mason's Harbour, make diversions as far as Vauban's Line, the Abbey of Salsines, etc., and give his visitors as distinct a history of each of their attacks as of that of the Gate of St. Nicholas, where he had the honour to receive his wound. But the desire of knowledge, like the thirst of riches, increases ever with the acquisition of it. The more my Uncle Toby pored over his map, the more he took a liking to it, by the same process and electrical assimilation, as I told you, through which I ween the souls of connoisseurs themselves, by long friction and incubation, have the happiness, at length, to get all bevirtued, be pictured, be butterflied, and befiddled. The more my Uncle Toby drank of this sweet fountain of science, the greater was the heat and impatience of his thirst, so that before the first year of his confinement had well gone round, there was scarce a fortified town in Italy or Flanders, of which, by one means or other, he had not procured a plan, reading over as he got them, and carefully collating therewith the histories of their sieges, their demolitions, their improvements and new works, all which he would read with that intense application and delight that he would forget himself, his wound, his confinement, his dinner. In the second year, my Uncle Toby purchased Gemelli and Cattaneo, translated from the Italian. Likewise Stevinus, Marolis, and the Chevalier de Ville, Lorini, Cochon, Scheiter, the Count de Pagan, the Marshal Vauban, Monsieur Blondel, with almost as many more books of military architecture as Don Quixote was found to have of chivalry when the curate and barber invaded his library. Towards the beginning of the third year, which was in August 99, my Uncle Toby found it necessary to understand a little of projectiles, and having judged it best to draw his knowledge from the fountainhead, he began with N. Tartaglia, who, it seems, was the first man who detected the imposition of a cannonball's doing all that mischief under the notion of a right line. This N. Tartaglia proved to my Uncle Toby to be an impossible thing, Endless is the search of truth. No sooner was my Uncle Toby satisfied which road the cannonball did not go, but he was insensibly led on, and resolved in his mind to inquire and find out which road the ball did go, for which purpose he was obliged to set off afresh with old Malthus, and studied him devoutly. He proceeded next to Galileo and Torricellius, wherein, by certain geometrical rules infallibly laid down, he found the precise path to be a parabola, or else an hyperbola, and that the parameter, or latus rectum, of the conic section of the said path, was to the quantity and amplitude in a direct ratio as the whole line to the sine of double the angle of incidence formed by the breach upon an horizontal plane, and that the semi-parameter— "Stop, my dear Uncle Toby, stop! Go not 1 foot further into this thorny and bewildered track. Intricate are the steps, intricate are the mazes of this labyrinth, intricate are the troubles which the pursuit of this bewitching phantom knowledge will bring upon thee. Oh, my uncle, fly, fly, fly from it as from a serpent. Is it fit, good-natured man, thou shouldst sit up with a wound upon thy groin whole nights, baking thy blood with hectic watchings? Alas, 'twill exasperate thy symptoms, check thy perspirations, evaporate thy spirits, waste thy animal strengths, dry up thy radical moisture, bring thee into a costive habit of body, impair thy health, and hasten all the infirmities of thy old age. Oh, my Uncle Toby." Chapter 4. I would not give a groat for that man's knowledge in Pencroft, who doesn't understand this, that the best plain narrative in the world, tacked very close to the last spirited apostrophe to my Uncle Toby, would have felt both cold and vapid upon the reader's palate. Therefore I forthwith put an end to the chapter, though I was in the middle of my story. Writers of my stamp have one principle in common with painters. Where an exact copying makes our pictures less striking, we choose the less evil, deeming it even more pardonable to trespass against truth than beauty. This is to be understood cum grano salis, but be it as it will, as the parallel is made more for the sake of letting the apostrophe cool than anything else, it is not very material whether upon any or other score the reader approves of it or not. In the latter end of the 3rd year, my Uncle Toby, perceiving that the parameter and semi-parameter of the conic section angered his wound, he left off the study of projectiles in a kind of a huff, and betook himself to the practical part of fortification only, the pleasure of which, like a spring held back, returned upon him with redoubled force. It was in this year that my uncle began to break in upon the daily regularity of a clean shirt, to dismiss his barber unshaven, and to allow his surgeon scarce time sufficient to dress his wound, concerning himself so little about it, as not to ask him once in 7 times dressing how it went on. When lo, all of a sudden, for the change was quick as lightning, he began to sigh heavily for his recovery, complained to my father, grew impatient with the surgeon, and one morning, as he heard his foot coming upstairs, he shut up his books and thrust aside his instruments in order to expostulate with him upon the protraction of his cure, which, he told him, might surely have been accomplished at least by that time. He dwelt along upon the miseries that he had undergone, and the sorrows of his 4 years' melancholy imprisonment, adding that had it not been for the kind looks and fraternal cheerings of the best of brothers, he had long since sunk under his misfortunes. My father was by. My Uncle Toby's eloquence brought tears into his eyes. It was unexpected. My Uncle Toby, by nature, was not eloquent. It had the greater effect. The surgeon was confounded, not that there wanted grounds for such or greater marks of impatience, but was unexpected too. In the 4 years he had attended him, he had never seen anything like it in my Uncle Toby's carriage. He had never once dropped one fretful or discontented word. He had been all patience, all submission. We lose the right of complaining sometimes by forbearing it, but we oftener treble the force. The surgeon was astonished, but much more so, when he heard my Uncle Toby go on and peremptorily insist upon his healing up the wound directly, or sending for Monsieur Ronjat, the king's surgeon, to do it for him. The desire of life and health is implanted in man's nature. The love of liberty and enlargement is a sister passion to it. These my Uncle Toby had in common with his species, and either of them had been sufficient to account for his earnest desire to get well and out of doors. But I have told you before that nothing wrought with our family after the common way, and from the time and manner in which this eager desire shewed itself in the present case, The penetrating reader will suspect there was some other cause or crotchet for it in my Uncle Toby's head. There was so. It is the subject of the next chapter to set forth what that cause and crotchet was. I own, when that's done, it will be time to return back to the parlour fireside where we left my Uncle Toby in the middle of his sentence. Chapter 5. When a man gives himself up to the government of a ruling passion, or in other words, when his hobby-horse grows headstrong, farewell cool reason and fair discretion. My Uncle Toby's wound was near well, and as soon as the surgeon recovered his surprise, and could get leave to say as much, he told him 'twas just beginning to incarnate, and that if no fresh exfoliation happened, which there was no signs of, it would be dried up in 5 or 6 weeks. The sound of as many Olympiads 12 hours before would have conveyed an idea of shorter duration to my Uncle Toby's mind. The succession of his ideas was now rapid. He broiled with impatience to put his design in execution, and so without consulting further with any soul living, which by the by I think is right when you are determined to take no one's soul's advice, he privately ordered Trim, his man, to pack up a bundle of lint and dressings, and hire a chariot and 4 to be at the door exactly by 12 o'clock that day, when he knew my father would be upon a change. So, leaving a banknote upon the table for the surgeon's care of him, and a letter of tender thanks for his brothers, he packed up his maps, his books of fortification, his instruments, etc., and by the help of a crutch on one side and Trim on the other, my Uncle Toby embarked for Shandy Hall. The reason, or rather the rise, of this sudden denigration was as follows. The table in my Uncle Toby's room, and at which, the night before this change happened, he was sitting with his maps, etc., about him, being somewhat of the smallest, for that infinity of great and small instruments of knowledge which usually lay crowded upon it, he had the accident in reaching over for his tobacco-box to throw down his compasses, and in stooping to take the compasses up with his sleeve he threw down his case of instruments and snuffers. And as the dice took a run against him in his endeavouring to catch the snuffers in falling, he thrust Monsieur Blondel off the table and Count Pagan on top of him. 'Twas to no purpose for a man, lame as my Uncle Toby was, to think of redressing all these evils by himself. He rang his bell for his man Trim. "Trim," quoth my Uncle Toby, "prithee see what a confusion I have here been making. I must have some better contrivance, Trim. Canst not thou take my rule and measure the length and breadth of this table, and then go and bespeak me one as big again?" "Yes, and please your honour," replied Trim, making a bow. "But I hope your honour will be soon well enough to get down to your country seat, where, as your honour takes so much pleasure in fortification, we could manage this matter to a T. I must here inform you that this servant of my Uncle Toby's, who went by the name of Trim, had been a corporal in my uncle's own company. His real name was James Butler, but having got the nickname of Trim in the regiment, my Uncle Toby, unless when he happened to be very angry with him, would never call him by any other name. The poor fellow had been disabled for the service by a wound on his left knee by a musket bullet at the Battle of Landen, which was 2 years before the affair of Namur. And as the fellow was well beloved in the regiment and a handy fellow into the bargain, my Uncle Toby took him for his servant, and of excellent use was he, attending my Uncle Toby in the camp and in his quarters as valet, groom, barber, cook, sempster, and nurse, and indeed from first to last waited upon him, and served him with great fidelity and affection. My Uncle Toby loved the man in return, and what attached him more to him still was the similitude of their knowledge, for Corporal Trim, for so for the future I shall call him, by 4 years' occasional attention to his master's discourse upon fortified towns, and the advantage of prying and peeping continually into his master's plans, etc., exclusive and besides what he gained hobby-horsically as a body servant, non-hobby-horsical per se, had become no mean proficient in the science, and was thought by the cook and chambermaid to know as much of the nature of strongholds as my Uncle Toby himself. I have but one more stroke to give to finish Corporal Trim's character, and it is the only dark line in it. The fellow loved to advise, or rather to hear himself talk. His carriage, however, was so perfectly respectful, 'twas easy to keep him silent when you had him so. But set his tongue a-going, you had no hold of him. He was voluble. The eternal interlardings of your honour with the respectfulness of Corporal Trim's manner interceding so strong in behalf of his elocution, that though you might have been incommoded, you could not well be angry. My Uncle Toby was seldom either the one or the other with him, or at least this fault, in Trim broke no squares with him. My Uncle Toby, as I said, loved the man, and besides, as he ever looked upon a faithful servant, but as a humble friend, he could not bear to stop his mouth. Such was Corporal Trim. If I durst presume, continued Trim, to give your honour my advice, and speak my opinion in this matter. Thou art welcome, Trim, quoth my Uncle Toby. Speak what thou thinkest upon the subject, man, without fear. Why then, replied Trim, not hanging his ears and scratching his head like a country lout, but stroking his hair back from his forehead and standing erect as before his division. I think, quoth Trim, advancing his left, which was his lame leg, a little forwards, and pointing with his right hand open towards a map of Dunkirk, which was pinned against the bar hangings, I think, quoth Corporal Trim, with humble submission to your honour's better judgment, that these ravelins, bastions, curtains, and hornworks make but a poor, contemptible, fiddle-faddle piece of work of it here upon paper, compared to what your honour and I could make of it, were we in the country by ourselves, and had but a rood or a rood and a half of ground to do what we pleased with. The summer is coming on, continued Trim. Your honour might sit out of doors and give me the ethnography, call it ethnography, quoth my uncle, of the town or citadel your honour was pleased to sit down before, and I will be shot by your honour upon the glacis of it, if I did not fortify it to your honour's mind. I dare say thou wouldst, Trim, quoth my uncle, for if your honour, continued the corporal, could but mark me the polygon with its exact lines and angles, that I could do very well, quoth my uncle. I would begin with a fosse, and if your honour could tell me the proper depth and the breadth. I can to a hair's breadth, Trim, replied my uncle. I would throw out the earth upon this hand towards the town for the scarp, and on that hand towards the campaign for the counterscarp. Very right, Trim, quoth my Uncle Toby, and when I had sloped them to your mind, and please your honour, I would face the glacis as the finest fortifications are done in Flanders with swords, and as your honour knows they should be, and I would make the walls and parapets with swords too. The best engineers call them gazons, Trim, said my Uncle Toby. Whether they are gazons or swords is not much matter, replied Trim. Your honour knows they are 10 times beyond a facing either of brick or stone. I know they are, Trim, in some respects, quoth my Uncle Toby, nodding his head. For a cannon-ball enters into the gazon right onwards, without bringing any rubbish down with it, which might fill the fosse, as well as the case at St. Nicholas's gate, and facilitate the passage over it. Your honour understands these matters, replied Corporal Trim, better than any officer in his Majesty's service. But would your honour please to let the bespeaking of the table alone, and let us but go into the country? I would work under your honour's directions like a horse, and make fortifications for you something like a tansy, with all their batteries, saps, ditches, and palisades, that it should be worth all the world's riding 20 miles to go and see it. My Uncle Toby blushed as red as scarlet as Trim went on, but it was not a blush of guilt, of modesty, or of anger. It was a blush of joy. He was fired with Corporal Trim's project and description. Trim, said my Uncle Toby, thou hast said enough. We might begin the campaign, continued Trim, on the very day that His Majesty and the Allies take the field, and demolish town by town as fast as— Trim, quoth my Uncle Toby, say no more. Your honour, continued Trim, might sit in your armchair, pointing to it, this fine weather, giving me your orders, and I would say no more, Trim, quoth my Uncle Toby. Besides, your honour would get not only pleasure and good pastime, but good air and good exercise and good health, and your honour's wound would be well in a month. Thou hast said enough, Trim, quoth my Uncle Toby, putting his hand into his breeches pocket. I like thy project mightily, and if your honour pleases, I'll this moment go and buy a pioneer's spade to take down with us, and I'll bespeak a shovel and a pickaxe and a couple of— Say no more, Trim, quoth my Uncle Toby, leaping up upon one leg, quite overcome with rapture, and thrusting a guinea into Trim's hand. Trim, said my Uncle Toby, say no more, but go down, Trim, this moment, my lad, and bring up my supper this instant. Trim ran down and brought up his master's supper, to no purpose. Trim's plan of operation ran so in my Uncle Toby's head he could not taste it. Trim, quoth my Uncle Toby, get me to bed. 'Twas all one. Corporal Trim's description had fired his imagination. My Uncle Toby could not shut his eyes. The more he considered it, the more bewitching the scene appeared to him, so that 2 full hours before daylight he had come to a final determination, and had concerted the whole plan of his and Corporal Trim's decampment. My Uncle Toby had a little neat country house of his own in the village where my father's estate lay at Shandy, which had been left him by an old uncle with a small estate of about £100 a year. Behind this house, and contiguous to it, was a kitchen garden of about half an acre. and at the bottom of the garden, and cut off from it by a tall yew hedge, was a bowling green containing just about as much ground as Corporal Trim wished for, so that as Trim uttered the words, "a raw rood and a half of ground to do what they would with," this identical bowling green instant presented itself, and became curiously painted, all at once, upon the retina of my Uncle Toby's fancy, which was the physical cause of making him change colour, or at least of heightening his blush to that immoderate degree I spoke of. Never did lover post down to a beloved mistress with more heat and expectation than my Uncle Toby did to enjoy this self-same thing in private. I say in private, for it was sheltered from the house, as I told you, by a tall yew hedge, and was covered on the other 3 sides from mortal sight by rough holly and thick-set flowering shrubs, so that the idea of not being seen did not a little contribute to the idea of pleasure preconceived in my Uncle Toby's mind. Vain thought, however thick it was planted about, or private soever it might seem, to think, dear Uncle Toby, of enjoying a thing which took up a whole rood and a half of ground, and not have it known. How my Uncle Toby and Corporal Trim managed this matter, with the history of their campaigns, which were no way barren of events, may make no uninteresting underplot in the epitasis and working out of this drama. At present the scene must drop, and change for the parlour fireside. Καλό βράδυ.